America built a wall around the world's most powerful AI chips. That wall was supposed to hold, but a new crack may have just appeared, and almost no one is paying attention to the detail that matters most. Because if advanced U.S. chips are already powering AI development inside China, then export controls are no longer a barrier. There is speed bump. And that changes the entire balance of the AI race. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you what U.S. officials say happened, why it matters strategically, and what may be unfolding behind the official narrative. Here's the core claim. A senior official in the Trump administration says a Chinese AI startup, DeepSeek, trained its newest model using Nvidia's most advanced AI chip architecture, Blackwell. That matters because Blackwell sits at the very top of the compute hierarchy. It is built for massive AI workloads, faster training, larger models, more efficient inference, and lower cost per unit of computation at scale. In other words, Blackwell is not just a better chip, it is a capability multiplier. And this is exactly the class of hardware that U.S. export controls are designed to keep out of China. The official statement carries two additional implications that make it more than a single company story. First, the model DeepSeek trained is expected to be released soon, not months from now, potentially within days. That suggests whatever compute DeepSeek accessed was not theoretical. It was operational. It was deployed. It was running. Second, the official says the chips were likely clustered in a data center located in Inner Mongolia, firmly inside Chinese territory. That location detail matters because it moves the issue from cloud access or offshore compute into something more physical: hardware, racks, power, cooling, facilities, and logistics inside China. And that brings us to the uncomfortable question. How does restricted American hardware end up powering AI development inside China under a U.S. policy that is supposed to block it? The official did not publicly explain how the U.S. government obtained the information or how DeepSeek acquired the chips, but the message was blunt. U.S. policy is not to ship Blackwells to China. That line is not just a denial, it's a warning. Because if the U.S. is not shipping Blackwells to China, and Blackwells are showing up inside China, then there are only a few possible categories of explanation. 1. Diversion through third countries. A chip is legally shipped to a place where it is allowed, then re-exported, resold, or moved onward through intermediaries. 2. Acquisition through gray markets. High-end computing equipment does not only move through official corporate contracts. There are secondary markets, resellers, brokers, and leasing channels. In a global ecosystem, anything valuable creates a shadow supply chain. 3. Indirect access through data center relationships. Even if physical chips are restricted, compute can be accessed through infrastructure hosted elsewhere, subsidiaries, joint ventures, or shell arrangements. Or 4. Something even more direct, like smuggling, not at the level of one ship in a suitcase, but at the level of enterprise-scale movement that can support clustered training. And the official added one more detail that shifts the story from "they got the chip" to "they may be hiding the evidence." The U.S. believes DeepSeek could remove technical indicators that would reveal the use of American chips. That matters because it signals intent, not just possession. If a company is actively trying to erase traces of what hardware trained a model, that suggests they believe exposure would trigger consequences, legal, financial, or geopolitical. It also suggests a broader strategic reality. Enforcement is not just about regulating exports, it's about verifying compliance in a world where AI systems can be trained behind closed doors and the evidence can be obscured. Nvidia did not comment publicly on the claim. DeepSeek did not respond to requests for comment. The U.S. Commerce Department also did not respond in the reporting you provided. China's embassy in Washington did respond, but not by addressing the specifics. The message was political. Beijing opposes what it describes as drawing ideological lines, overstretching national security, expanding export controls, and politicizing economic and technological issues. At China's foreign ministry briefing, a spokesperson said they were not aware of the circumstances and reiterated China's existing stance on U.S. chip restrictions. Notice what's missing: a direct denial about Blackwell being used inside China. That absence doesn't prove the claim is true, but in geopolitical communication, the choice of what not to deny is often as revealing as what is denied.
Why does this matter beyond one startup? Because compute is the bottleneck of frontier AI. Modern AI progress rests on three pillars: algorithms, data, and compute. Algorithms can spread. They can be published, leaked, replicated, and improved incrementally. Data can be collected domestically at scale. Compute is different. Compute is capital-intensive. It requires advanced manufacturing, massive infrastructure, and physical supply chains. Compute is the part that governments believed they could control. That was the underlying assumption behind export controls. Deny top-tier compute, and you slow the training of frontier models. The U.S. bet heavily on that assumption. If that assumption is failing, the strategic consequences are real. Because the purpose of export controls was not to stop China forever, it was to buy time. Time for U.S. companies to stay ahead. Time for allies to coordinate controls. Time for domestic capacity to expand. Time to harden the supply chain. Time to prevent advanced systems from accelerating military applications. If Blackwell-class compute is already running inside China, then the time gap shrinks, the strategic buffer collapses, and that forces a shift in policy. The reporting also points to a growing divide inside Washington about where the line should be drawn. On one side, there are voices arguing that selling advanced chips, even limited versions, can actually slow China's domestic competitors. The logic is simple. If Chinese firms rely on Nvidia, they may invest less aggressively in replacing it. That argument has been associated with figures like the White House AI czar David Sachs and Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang. On the other side are China hawks focused on national security risk. Their concern is that even if chips are sold for commercial use, they can be diverted to military applications. In their view, any leakage of advanced compute into China strengthens China's strategic position, including its military modernization. And the DeepSeek claim becomes a powerful piece of evidence for the hawkish argument. If a leading Chinese AI company is already using restricted chips, the hawks will say, "This is exactly what we warned about. You cannot rely on compliance. You cannot rely on conditions. You cannot assume the end use will remain purely commercial." One former National Security Council official put it bluntly in the reporting. Exporting AI chips to China is dangerous precisely because conditions meant to restrict military use cannot be enforced if companies are already violating controls.
Export controls only work if enforcement holds. And enforcement is hardest where global supply chains, third-party jurisdictions, and digital infrastructure intersect. The U.S. export controls currently bar Blackwell shipments to China. There's also a recent policy history that matters. At one point, President Trump opened the door to Nvidia selling a scaled-down version of Blackwell in China. Later, he reversed course, suggesting the most advanced chips should be reserved for U.S. companies and kept out of China. Then there's the H200, Nvidia's second most advanced chip mentioned in the reporting. Trump's decision to allow Chinese firms to buy H200 chips drew sharp criticism from China hawks, and even with approvals, shipments were reportedly stalled because of guardrails built into those approvals. So the political environment is already tense. Now imagine how this DeepSeek claim lands inside that debate. If Chinese firms are allegedly relying on smuggled or diverted Blackwells, then allowing H200 approvals could be framed as giving a lifeline to China's AI ecosystem. Another former NSC official referenced in the reporting argued that reliance on smuggled Blackwells shows a massive shortfall in Chinese domestic AI chips and that H200 approvals would help fill that gap. This is a strategic tug-of-war inside U.S. policy. Do you tighten further, even if it accelerates decoupling and pushes China to invest harder in domestic alternatives? Or do you allow controlled sales, betting that dependency on Western chips slows domestic competitors? The DeepSeek case doesn't just add noise, it pressures the U.S. to pick a direction. And it raises a second layer of concern that is less about chips and more about model development itself. The U.S. official also suggested that the model DeepSeek trained likely relied on a technique known as distillation, using outputs of older, stronger models to train a newer model, transferring capabilities indirectly. This matters because it points to a second control problem. Even if compute controls held perfectly, model capability can still diffuse through techniques that compress knowledge from top-tier systems into smaller, cheaper systems. That is why the AI race is not just about who has the best single model, it's about who can scale capability across an ecosystem: hardware, software, talent, infrastructure, and deployment. DeepSeek is not new to that story. The company shook markets earlier with models that rivaled some of the best U.S. offerings, triggering concerns that China could close the gap despite restrictions. And now the allegation is more severe. Not only is a Chinese company producing competitive models, but it may be doing it with the very class of U.S. hardware meant to be denied. If confirmed, that is more than a loophole. It's a signal that the containment strategy is porous. So what happens next? If U.S. policymakers accept this as credible, the response is likely to expand beyond chip shipments. Expect increased scrutiny on third-country distributors, more aggressive enforcement on re-exports, pressure on allies and partners to align controls, potential requirements targeting cloud providers to prevent indirect access to restricted compute, and possibly financial penalties aimed at intermediaries who enable diversion. But there is a trade-off. The more aggressively the U.S. tightens, the more the global technology world fractures. Decoupling accelerates, countries are pushed to choose sides, supply chains split, standards diverge, and the AI ecosystem starts to resemble two parallel worlds, one anchored by the United States and its allies, one anchored by China and its industrial partners. That fragmentation has long-term consequences for innovation, for trade, for security, and for the economics of AI itself, because compute is becoming what oil was in a previous era, not just a commodity, a strategic resource, a foundation of power. If China can access advanced compute despite restrictions, it compresses the timeline of competition, it reduces the leverage of U.S. policy, and it forces Washington to confront an uncomfortable reality. Technological dominance cannot be protected by rules alone. It depends on enforcement credibility. It depends on supply chain control. It depends on infrastructure visibility. And it depends on whether the barrier actually holds in the real world, not just on paper. So here's the key takeaway. This story is not only about DeepSeek, it's about the credibility of the entire semiconductor containment strategy. Because if the most advanced chips are already finding their way into restricted environments, then the next phase of the AI race is already underway. A phase defined not just by innovation, but by enforcement, adaptation, and strategic improvisation. And in that phase, the decisive question is no longer who invents first, it's who can sustain advantage under pressure. Because in the race for artificial intelligence supremacy, control only works if it holds. And if the wall is cracking, the world is about to learn what comes after containment.